Hello, everyone. Today is Thursday, the 9th of November. I'm uploading this just before I assign the week 12 module. If I go to course materials real quick, you'll notice that week 12 is still here. In fact, I should edit it. Um, Originally, I had thought about assigning uh, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles as your first play. I decided not to for a couple of reasons. One, it's the Greek tradition, and they really did start um, the idea of a drama to be set on a stage and performed in front of a live audience. But I think a lot of the terminologies, I think, sort of dated, and frankly, a lot of the literary devices or techniques that are being used are kind of basic, and I think there are better plays that I think are more relevant to what we see and hear today, and I think that you guys would probably relate to more. And Oedipus Rex, I think, is done to death. I think in any literature class. So if you haven't read it already, I still recommend that you do, or if not, at least watch a live version of it, because there are lots and lots of references to it even today. But I'm going to instead, and I think if I go ahead and check the week 12, I haven't uploaded it quite yet because I'm still making changes to it. But I decided instead that we're going to read A Dollhouse by Henrik Ibsen. Um, Now, so in preparation for your reading of this play, I do want to talk about what drama is and how it relates to what we've covered so far this semester. Okay, and the best way to do it, I think, is by looking at the short story first, because that's what we started with this semester, and we know that there are certain elements of a short story. We know that there's a plot in a short story. We talked about Freytag's pyramid and how sometimes that plot can change, and that it's not necessarily like this sort of closed structure. It varies, right? It has characters, right? Short stories have characters. Well, so do plays. In fact, that's really what it's kind of the main driving point of most plays, is that we need to have characters. Um, Whereas short stories, you can sort of bend what we mean by characters. A good example is Manhattan Transfer. It's a pretty well-known novel, but where the main character is actually the city itself. That seems to be where everything takes place, and it seems to have an effect on the people that come in and out of the city. But here, by character in plays, we usually mean people or forces or personified or anthropomorphized characters that represent other elements, and that varies. We see this a lot with Greek tragedies and Greek comedies, where we see sort of this sort of otherworldly side. We have oracles and gods that usually participate in plays, and um, even though they are not, let's say, human, we can still humanize them and present them in a play. We still have themes, right? Because they are sort of story driven or story based, most of them are going to have themes, right? Poetry has themes, stories have themes, and of course, so do plays. Most literature has a theme, even if it's not overt. There's usually some sort of theme that's going on, or some sort of commentary that's happening. And plays also rely very heavily on settings, where they're going on. So if you've ever seen a play, or even just a Broadway musical, for instance, you'll know that plays very much depend on stage direction, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It also depends a lot on costuming, on set design, on movement on the stage itself, but also on projection, right? So these actors on the stage had to project their voices. And I want to make this big difference between a play and a film, for instance, right? There are film versions, for instance, of Oedipus Rex, as well as there's a film version, I think, with Anthony Hopkins of A Doll's House. And what you're not going to get from the film is this sort of immediacy, right? Everything's happening right there in front of you. And when you're there sitting in front of a stage, there lots of little things can happen, right? There's no such thing. When I was a theater student, I was told over and over again by my theater director that there's no such thing as a perfect play or perfect performance. Something is going to inevitably go wrong. It just does. And so with film, you can sort of cut that out, right? If there's a mistake or someone forgets their line, it's okay. You can do a retake and, cut through maybe some film and maybe a little bit of your budget, but at least you can retake it. Can't do that live. So when mistakes happen, they stay happening. And if you're with good actors, often the actors will either just keep going and pretend it didn't happen, or they'll even work it into the play somehow and kind of laugh it off and get the audience involved too. But if you've ever been in a high school production before, I have too, then it's sometimes embarrassing because then everyone freezes and nobody knows what to do, and the director's frankly is frustrated and is trying to hurriedly get people to pay attention and start over. And so it can be a little bit embarrassing. But when we think of these plays and we're looking at them in the written form, right? It takes a lot more sort of attention and imagination on our part as readers instead of as viewers, right? And that's the other thing that's kind of important. When we think of short stories, we do think of, the author as a writer and the audience as a reader. With poetry, we said, well, that's true sort of with poetry, but usually we think of a speaker and a listener. And now with plays, we don't have that either. Instead, we have performers and this live audience who are onlooking. And so there is a sharp distinction we should draw. So although plays and short stories have these things in common, there is several things that are different, and I want to talk about them here. Your book also mentions some of this towards the back of your book. There's a whole section on how to read literature, and there is a smaller section on plays, and it mentions these things. It mentions dialogue, diction, and spectacle. And a lot of these terms actually come directly from Aristotle. He wrote the book literally on rhetoric, but he didn't just focus on rhetoric like political rhetoric that we see or argumentation in sort of the secular industry. He also wrote the rhetorics of poetics, and not just poetry, but also the oral performance of drama. And so when he talks about dialogue, what we're really talking about is this sort of heavy burden that plays place on dialogue. Everything is about dialogue, right? Some short stories do this too. Hemingway famously did this in one of his short stories called Hills Like White Elephants, where there's this sort of subtle conversation going on between two characters, and you're not really sure what's going on, but there's these sort of undertones. But the story relies very much on dialogue. There are, of course, some sentences where it tells you, the setting, maybe gives you some details about where, they're in a bar and they're drinking this anís de toro, and and it has these sort of little details, and those kind of help color the conversation a bit. So it's not entirely on dialogue. But when we read a play, you'll notice right away that you're going to have directions, right? In fact, let me pull up Oedipus Rex. Let me just find a PDF of it. Any PDF should do. And you'll notice that there's going to be a couple of things that look different on the page, just off the bat. One thing we're going to notice is the very beginning is going to have a list of characters, right? The characters are listed here for us at the very beginning. It might even give us a little bit of a description of who they are or what they are. More contemporary plays will have a much longer description than what's included here in Oedipus the King. Usually, after the list of characters, there's going to be a scene, right? It tells you, here's the scene, this is where you are. Here, the scene takes place in front of the palace of Oedipus at Thebes. To the right of the stage, near the altar, stands the priest with a crowd of children. Oedipus emerges from the central door. And you'll have sort of these instructions about what's going to happen. And those instructions serve several purposes, right? For a director who's trying to direct a play, they're going to read those directions and say, okay, this is sort of my vision for where I want people to stand, where I want my actors to stand. But it will also serve a purpose of set design, right? If you want to be in Greece, for instance, or in Thebes, more specifically, You might want to have pillars that sort of represent that time period, and so it becomes a matter of like, well, if I know the characters need to be standing in such and such spot on the stage, then I also need to have props or set pieces laying around in certain places. This is also true of costuming, right? We also want to make sure that the costume is right, and sometimes there will be some direction, although you'll notice here the costumes weren't really mentioned here, mostly because plays were sort of a new thing. Sophocles was sort of the main or the biggest playwright for Greece at the time, so most of their plays were based on their own time, so they just wore what they wore, and that was usually enough. Maybe they might wear a mask or two to show expression more easily to a larger crowd, but it just it really depended on the play itself. And you'll notice here now, if I scroll down a little bit, you'll notice that out here to the left, they'll mention the character's name followed by a colon, meaning that that character is speaking, and whatever follows is what they say. You'll also notice that sometimes there will be elements in brackets. This is called stage direction, and this is what's happening on the stage. And then, of course, when someone else speaks, it has their name listed again, and we move on. Okay. Luckily, with some of your plays, because they're in this book, you might notice that they have sorts of these definitions towards the bottom. This is just some PDF I found online, but your book will probably be faithful to that too. So if there's any sort of historical or contextual or sort of cultural detail that you might not be familiar with, your book will make it clear for you. But for the most part, the plays that I've selected, I think, have excellent translations, especially A Doll's House. That's originally a, what was it? Is it Norway? Yeah, I think it's from Norway, and I know there's certain Russian translations. It might be Danish. I'm having a hard time remembering right now. But there are several translations of it that are going around, and the translation in your book, I think, is pretty close to the one I've read when I was in graduate school. Again, you can just use your judgment for sort of the language that you see. Okay, back to this document here. So we talked about dialogue. Diction is sort of related to dialogue. Diction here, we mean word choice. And word choice in short stories is similar to what it means in plays. In short stories, when we think of diction, we're thinking of what was the exact word that best fits here? What word is doing the most work at this point in the story? It might also mean, if I want to use a specific set of words over and over again because they reinforce the theme, then I might do that too. In plays, it's similar, but because we're working almost entirely with dialogue, the words that come out of a character's mouth must be precise. And as you'll see with Doll's House, you'll see this too with Trifles, that's the other play that you're going to read too. You'll see this with several plays, that the characters will say something and mean something else entirely. It's a type of irony, and we call it dramatic irony, but it's subtle, because sometimes that word that they chose is a pun, right? It's a play on words. Sometimes they'll say, this is also very famous, The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. His name is Ernest, or one of the characters, aliases is named Ernest, but of course that's a play on the adjective earnest, being earnest or being truthful. And so there's these puns going on. Those are important to pay attention to. But also related to short stories, there are some word choice that we'll see in Oedipus Rex. This idea of sight actually becomes very sort of relevant. You're going to see words like blind or see or sight or eyes, things that are related to sight. And you see in here, now Oedipus great in all men's eyes. We see this sort of pattern. And if you've never read the play. I won't spoil it for you, but there's definitely something going on with sight throughout the entire one, both literally and figuratively. Okay, on to spectacle. Now, spectacle is different. Spectacle is very unique to plays. It does not exist for short stories, and it certainly doesn't exist for poetry. But spectacle means, what we actually see on the stage. Where movement comes from, the set direction or stage direction. Where to exit. Because if you've ever seen a stage, right, there's usually four main sections of a play. We have sort of the curtain, which is like the front of the stage. We have the back, and then we have the left and right. And those are several entrances. In the Greek time, there was really only stage left and stage right. That was it. You entered from the left or you entered from the right. Now, if you've ever been in a more interactive place, some plays will be where a character sort of comes in from the back doors. Everyone's facing the stage, and then out of nowhere, one of the characters comes from the back door and enters the stage in the front. And that's, sort of meta, but that's sort of the point usually. There's some sort of point to having a character enter from that side. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. The other thing I want to bring to your attention, and this is mentioned in your book about how to read a play. And I'm just going to read directly to from the book to you right now on the first two paragraphs they have here. It says, "Very few of us read plays for pleasure in the same way that we might take a novel with us to the beach. This isn't surprising, right? Most playwrights, in fact, never intend for their plays to be read in this way. Drama is a living art, and if you read the play text on the page, you are getting only one part of what has made drama so important to all cultures across many time periods." Excuse me. "Plays are written for the stage and are meant to be experienced primarily in live performance. This means that as a reader, you must be especially attentive to nuances of language in a play, which often means imagining what might be happening on stage during a particular passage of speech." And by that, I think what they're trying to get at here is sort of gestures. Think about what the character is saying or doing. What they're doing physically, where they're moving as they're saying a line. There's this really famous line from Hamlet, where his mother is saying, "Out, damned spot, out," and we can imagine, and she's trying to wipe blood off her hands, and actually it's that's the wrong play. It's not his mother, his father, his uncle technically. He's saying, "Out, damned spot, out." And he's wiping his hands, and you can imagine him trying to get the blood off of his hands, and he can't seem to get this one spot out. It's like the blood's still staying there. And so it's very, if you're just reading on the page, it doesn't have the same sort of effect as if you saw it in a live performance. I'm sorry for the cough. The weather is sort of getting to me. This cold front is interesting. Excuse me. It says, "Using your imagination in this way, in effect, staging the play in your mind, will help you with some of the difficulties inherent in reading plays." And here's one more note that they have here, which I think is important. It says, "If you have access to film versions of the play that you are examining, be sure to watch them. Do bear in mind, though, that play scripts usually undergo substantial rewriting to adapt them for film, so you will still need to read the play in its original form, perhaps making comparisons between the stage and film versions." And I agree. I took a class of Shakespeare. All of Shakespeare's plays, I've read all of his plays. And not all of them are available in stage versions. Some of them are made for film. There is one with Judi Dench, actually, as Titania from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And that was actually a pretty good version, but there's I think 5 or 6 different popular versions of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And you're just going to have to, determine for yourself which one you think is right. But I was there following along with my book, watching the movie, and I would notice that some parts were just completely cut out. There were some parts where they just said, "No, we're not going to include that in the movie," and I'd have to catch up, right? So if you do find a film version, for instance, of A Doll's House, great. But keep in mind that there's probably going to be some language change. Maybe they skipped out an entire scene, because that does happen too. So be aware of that. Okay. So the plan here is that you have a quick discussion uh, board form to finish for this week. Um, because the play is so long, we're going to spend 2 weeks on it. The first week, you're going to have to read the first two acts. And then for the next week, you'll just read the final act, Act 3. And I think the end of Act 2 is a pretty good stopping point. After we read A Doll's House, I think we're going to read Susan Glaspell's Trifles, which, wow, it's a fantastic play. I love it. And then we'll probably finish off with a really easy one-act play called Sure Thing by David Ives. It's a funny story, too, because I met my wife, or I befriended my wife, I should say, because of David Ives and Sure Thing. It's one of my favorite plays, and I think you're going to find it sort of cute and adorable and romantic, but also funny and silly and sort of self-deprecating in a lot of ways. And so I want to finish the semester off with Sure Thing. And that one is not included in your book. It is included in the third edition of your book for some reason. I guess they took it out when they got to the fourth. So I'll just attach a PDF of Sure Thing when we get to it. So the plan is we're going to have 3 plays from here to the rest of the semester. It's going to be A Dollhouse, Trifles, and Sure Thing. And after that, that's it. We're done with the semester. We're just going to have the literary analysis to write. And it'll be pretty basic. I haven't written the instructions yet, but I have an idea of what I want you guys to do for that one. Expect to write a few more discussion board posts and forums, or responding to them before the semester's out. So if you guys have any questions about your grades, now would be the time to contact me. I know I've already started filling out drop forms. I haven't submitted any. But with online classes, it's sort of difficult to do that because there's no attendance. In fact, I don't have an attendance policy for online classes. But I do, or I can see the last date that Blackboard was accessed. So I'll be sending out emails to students who either have not accessed Blackboard in months, which I have a few students who haven't, and I'll contact them, letting them know that they'll be dropped before, I think the drop date is the 15th. Yeah, the next Wednesday. It's almost a week away. Some of you I'll be contacting because even though you have been sort of accessing Blackboard regularly, you're not doing well in the class, and we'll talk about whether or not you should drop or whether you want to take the F. It's up to you. But if you do have questions about that, please feel free to contact me so that we can come up with a plan, or might have to settle for a drop grade or a failing grade. Okay. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, text me. If you want to call me, you may, but I just ask that you send me a text in advance so that way I know that I'm available and I'll be free for your call. I'm also having office hours, although I should note I'm not going to be in my office this coming Monday the, 12th, 13th? 13th. I'm going to be in Houston with my wife. She's got a breast cancer appointment that I needed to, that I promised I'd go with her to. So I won't be in my office on Monday, but you should be able to see me Wednesday for sure. Okay. All right. Thank you guys.